find out the teeth and the design. So we're going to assess the 3 teeth that I prepared today, and it will be 2 or 3 teeth. Might be 2, might be 3, okay? So that means you need to be prepared to make your reduction guide at the beginning of the practical, because it'll depend on the teeth, right? So in this case, we'll start right up at the top here. You would you go ahead and put your exam ID number and the date. And then we prepared tooth number 22, 23, and 24, and they are a lingual chamfer preparation, all 3 of them, right? So that's how you'd fill out the top portion. Then we'll look at each one of the teeth based upon these categories, and we look at the facial surface, we look at your proximal extensions, and we look at how you've handled the incisal aspect of the preparations. And then the temporaries, that's a different assessment. We'll do that another day, probably next week. So let's look here. Yeah, if I can get my lamp on. Hope this doesn't wash this out, but I think you're going to focus up there anyway.
Yeah, you're okay.
Okay. So we got our perio probe, we got everything we need. We're gonna start, and we're gonna put the gingival third in place. And the first category is gingival margin placement. That's actually how does it look from the facial right there. And we're simply going to look at how supragingival they are. Tooth number 22 looks like it's in that 1/2 millimeter range. Yeah, well, I'm trying to do both here. Just a second. Let's go, because you may not be able to see what I'm looking at on the assessment, but I'm looking at the cervical margin with respect to the gingiva. And like all of your other preparations, ideal is 0.5 to 0.7. And as I look at those 3 preparations, I think I did a pretty good job. So I'm going to give myself full credit.
Is that just pre-prep?
Yes, yes. Just remember, this has no clinical relevance whatsoever. In fact, when you go to take the board exams, you need to ditch that thought, because they want it right down by the gum line. They give you a type-it-on, well, you buy a type-it-on for the board exam, and they want you within a 1/2 millimeter of the gingival line. And so if you're right on the gingival line, great, you're in that sweet spot. The reason we have you stay supragingival is we reuse these type-it-ons. And if you were down near, well, it's obvious, if you were down near the gingival line all the time, they'd be destroyed from the get-go. So we want you to stay away from them. It does, the only relevance is we do follow the gingival line with our preparations. It's just at what level, right? Does that make sense? So, gingival margin placement, we're going to go, we're in that 0.5 to 0.75 for all 3. So we're going to mark it right there. Now, the next 3 have to do with more just the facial depth. So this is where we're going to rely. The first category, axial depth at the gingival third. We'll lay this on the preparations. And then I'm going to look, and we'll take a perio probe out. It's important that you keep your matrix right up against, or your reduction guide. Now at the line angles, we allow you just a little over reduction. I am slightly over reduced on the canine. But the other 2 are within the zone. Can you see that? Can you see can you see at the mesial, the canine, I'm slightly over-reduced. So we're gonna mark that one over-reduced, but the other two, they're gonna be okay at the gingival third. So number 22 is slightly excessive. And then the other two, everybody, can you see that based upon that matrix? Now the next one, so the next category is axial depth at the incisal third. So now we're going to lay this matrix on top of that one. There's two ways to look at this, obviously, but it's this cut, and that's the first one. Now, remember, incisal reduction is 2. So we want you to be erring. If you err, you want to go thick. You want to go reduced here. We don't want it thin during that transition. So 0.5 to 0.7, yes, but if you're 0.7 to 1, and I probably should change that on here. Oh, it is. No, it isn't. I'm going to change that, because we want you 0.7 to 1 at this stage where it's getting toward the incisal. So that's the ideal, and I'll change that on the form. Does everybody get that? Why do we want that a little bit more? Can you see why that's important? 2 millimeters of incisal reduction, and if you go from 1/2 to 2 quickly, you've got a thin spot, a weak spot in your ceramic. So we want you gradually approaching that, so by the time you get to the incisal edge, maybe you're 0.7 to 1, because you're rounding that, okay? So we're gonna change that. So let's look at and let's assess these based upon that. Okay. Get my light in there. I would say we're pretty good. We're pretty good. Can you see how the reduction is just a little bit more? And that's what you want. You want it uniform, and you want it 0.7 to 1. You don't need to be more than that, but if you're down near 0.5, it's almost too thin there. So on this assessment, we'll put 0.7 to 1, which would be a little points off, but we'll change that. Now, overall uniformity, and with overall uniformity, we're looking at, is it uniformly reduced, both incisogingivally, buccolingually, how uniform is it? And because on the canine I was a little deep in one area there, the uniformity would be affected. So certainly 1 notch down, if that makes sense. I think the overall uniformity of the others, I was looking at that as we assess that. Let's just a sec. Let me get it placed right. So yeah, not too bad. We're in that zone of 0.5 to 0.7. Now we lay this one in on top. Yes. That's pretty uniform. Yes. What's that? You don't want to. By definition, if the uniformity is off, if you're within the zone that is allowable, it doesn't affect it in both categories. But let's say on your ceramic onlay preparation, that your shoulder was 1.7 in one area and it went down near 1 in another area. You'd either be over-reduced or under-reduced. And maybe, let's make it even simpler. Let's make it 1.5 in one area and 1 in another area. 1.3 to 1.5 is the sweet spot, right? So you dropped below that, so you'd be slightly under-reduced, but you'd also be not uniform. So oftentimes those two do affect each other, and both will get reduced points. So in other words, if you're within 1.3 to 1.5 and it varies, that could affect uniformity, but your depth will not be reduced. I mean, you won't lose any points for depth. Okay, all right. Okay, so we determined that that was pretty uniform all the way across on the other two. And now let's look at the proximal extensions. This is more critical, obviously, on an upper tooth to tuck in those proximal extensions. But we're going to look at two areas. We're going to look at the proximal contact area and the gingival embrasure area. If this were an upper tooth, we would want to make sure that you tuck it in toward the lingual, maxillary anterior. You're going to be about halfway toward the lingual. In the proximal contact area, slightly broken, and that ends up oftentimes being about halfway as well. In the lower anterior, like these are, we're 1/2 to 2/3. I don't know whether you can read that or not, but that's 1/2 to 2/3 toward the lingual, near the contact area. And in the gingival embrasure, we want to be 1/2 to 2/3 as well toward the lingual. So let's look and see if we're in those zones. So I need to hold this up and look at it closely, and then I'll put it in the camera for you to see. So in the proximal contact area, they're in that zone. So let me put, you can you see that? Let's look at the canine.
Can we zoom it just a little bit?
No. You see there? Okay, so what's the criteria for for all three in the contact area? And with lower anteriors, they end up being in about the same area. They're fairly vertical. They're not that way with upper anteriors. But if we look at the contact area, we're about 2/3 of the way through on all three of those teeth. Would you not, as we get closer to 24, it's more like half. 1/2 to 2/3. Same with 23. 22 is more like 2/3 of the way through. Okay, and then looking at the gingival area, you can see all the way down to the gingival area, it's the same. So all three of those are at least in the zone of where they should be interproximally. Does that make sense? Can everybody see that? So that's how those would be assessed. A little more critical on an upper because there's more variation there. But we will mark those like that. Okay. There we go. Okay? That makes sense. Now the last thing we're going to look at is the incisal reduction and then rounding. So what is the occlusal incisal design like? And because these are lingual chamfers, we want to be at least 2 millimeters reduced. And we want to see that little bit of a chamfer. We want, as it says in the description, the incisal butt margin is prepared uniformly to 0.5 to 0.7 in depth, but that's only for an upper tooth, right? Or if the margin is on the lingual surface, our incisal edge is reduced uniformly 2 to 2.5 And then we've handled the marginal area properly. So if this is a chamfer, we want to see a chamfer. We don't want it thinned out. And then any departure from that description. So again, as we look at these, you kind of have to look at them from the side. Well, you can even see it, unfortunately. Hard. You know, you can come up and look at these. You're gonna have to. Everything washes out, unless I can get a little. And that really washes it out if I put my lamp on it. So yeah. There. Okay. Yeah, you can see that incisal edge. So you can see the incisal reduction, the light chamfer on the lingual. On all three of those, hopefully you can see that. And then the other way we're going to assess this is with our matrix in place. So there's from the facial, and then we put this matrix in place right here, and we want to see that we're at least 2 millimeters reduced. You can take my word for it. They're right at 2, really close to it. And they're fairly uniformly reduced, and then rounding is the last category. So you're gonna look and make sure there's no sharp angles anywhere. And I think to get a good view of this, I would come up and just look at these. So let's back that off a little.
You want to focus?
Yeah, if we can bring it's really hard. It kind of washes out. Anyway, hopefully that gives you an idea what those look like. So, again, our incisal reduction is adequate, and we've rounded. So that's basically, and then what you'll do on these is you'll add up. You'll get a total. Each tooth is worth 100 points. So I lost on the canine. I lost 4. So that's a 96. I'm really being. This really are. They're bad preparations, but I'm giving myself 100. So what you do is you'd sum all the scores here. 296. Divide by 3. 296. That's the average score per tooth, and then that gets figured into the temporary score like on the other practicals for an out of 10 score. Does that make sense? Well, but it's out of 10. So that the total, so the average score for the preparations is added to the temporary, and then it's on an out of 10 scale. Yeah. The temps get graded once, and so this is the first year that we've had to, we're doing the kind of grading we're doing, but the temporaries are graded once and they're broken off. And so I still haven't decided how the fairest way to do that. I think what we'll end up doing is we'll have to grade the temporary and rotate the typodon a couple of times. And then break the temporary off, and then do the grading of the preparation. So we won't be able to do those all at the same time, because we're only going to get one shot at the temps. Yeah, what's that?
When you audit them, do you want us to take a picture of them first then, before turning them in, or are you not auditing this time?
Auditing.
Like grading all of them?
Yeah, so what we would do is we would grade your temporaries, and then rotate it and grade them again.
She means you.
Yeah,
When
but I
you
feel
go
like
to
there's no
audit.
way to ensure that.
And that's it. On the temporary part, that's why we're going to do it a couple of times, and we're probably going to stop at that point and have the instructors get involved. We got to do something at that point. Pictures, yeah, they give you a little bit of an idea, but they don't tell you occlusion or anything like that. So if anybody has any bright ideas on how to make that fair, let me know, because we only get one shot at the temporaries. Yeah, we could do that, I guess. Grade them one week and have me look at them that week. Yeah, you'd be without your typodonts a little longer. Yeah, yeah, I'll consider that. That's not a bad idea. Maybe stop at the temporary stage, and then I can look at all those and then do the same thing. So yeah, we'll,
Actually, that might work out because we're doing the competency before a midterm, so we have an extra week where we don't.
that's
have to
true.
do Oh, is it after? Never mind, I totally scratched.
But you do have a week, I think it's either spring, not spring break, it's the mock board, something's coming up. I know there's a week break off that following week. So, yeah, that's probably the way to do it. We may do that in 2 stages. Yeah, okay. Any questions on assessing the temporary, or the veneers? We'll go over the temporary assessment next week, okay?
And you said we could have 4 teeth possible?
I've never
Those
given
speak-
4. It's usually, there's four possible teeth on the assessment form, but there used to be 6 on the old one. But I've never given more than 3.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's usually 2, but could be
But
3.
this year,
You guys are so good, it could be 3. I don't know.
I don't know about that. I don't know which students
that's
you're-
here. You're typing up.